Tiger 131 is perhaps the most well-known vehicle in the Tank Museum's collection. It was the first Tiger to be captured intact, and the only one that still runs. It's been the subject of books, articles, and documentaries. Thanks to its appearance in the 2014 movie Fury, it's now arguably one of the most famous museum artifacts in the world. You can even play it in a video game. But if you thought there was nothing new to add to the story of Tiger 131, you'd be wrong.
This is because new information has come to light, which has caused us to reevaluate the evidence. I'm Kate Adie, former BBC Chief News Correspondent, and in this video, we'll explain how an ordinary visitor changed what we know about the capture of Tiger 131.
I just have the utmost respect for him and his colleagues. I just don't know how they could have done it.
It's well known that British forces disabled the infamous tank in Tunisia in 1943. It was the first example of the fearsome new German machine to be taken intact by the Western Allies. A lucky shot had wedged itself in the turret mechanism, causing it to jam. The crew were said to have panicked and fled, leaving the largely undamaged tank to be recovered from the battlefield. Tiger 131 was recovered and shipped to the UK and underwent extensive evaluation led by Lieutenant Peter Gudgeon at the School of Tank Technology. His work went on to inform future tank design. Gudgeon had himself been recently fighting Tigers in Tunisia as a troop leader with 48 Royal Tank Regiment. On the 21st of April 1943, he was knocked out of his Churchill tank whilst taking part in an attack on Jebel Jaffa. An 88mm shell, probably fired by a Tiger, penetrated the frontal armour of his Churchill, but he was able to bail out with only minor injuries. The regimental war diary is held in the Tank Museum archive. It reports that later inspection of the battlefield revealed that a total of 5 enemy tanks were disabled in the fighting, 3 of which it states were not damaged at all seriously. Among these was a Panzerkampfwagen Mark VI, now generally referred to as a Tiger I.
Throughout the rest of his life, Gudgeon believed that the Tiger tank, abandoned on his objective at Jebel Jaffa, was Tiger 131. He was certain that the tank that knocked him out was the same tank that he spent the rest of his war evaluating. We now believe that he was mistaken.
Peter Gudgeon's account gained widespread circulation during the 1980s through his published work. It had been adopted as fact by the Tank Museum until a retired civil servant made his first visit to the museum.
I'm Dale Oscroft and I come from sunny Nashfield in Nottinghamshire. I first visited the Tank Museum in 2012. My wife and I were on holiday and decided to pay a visit.
Coming face to face with Tiger 131, he was struck by the similarity of its story with something he'd been told years before by his father.
My father was John Oscroft. He served with the 2nd Battalion Sherwood Foresters in the Second World War.
One story that remained with Dale was his father's first encounter with a Tiger tank. John had told him that this was the first Tiger to be captured intact.
My father didn't say very much about his war service. He kept his war experiences to himself. So as a teenager, I've quite often prompted him to talk about it. The hilltop that the Foresters had been told to attack had been attacked the previous day by another battalion. So my father was naturally a little apprehensive about the coming attack, particularly as it would be his first time in action. But he was reassured by the news that the attack would be supported by tanks.
But the tanks failed to arrive, and the Foresters had to attack without them. John described it as a terrible baptism of fire.
As soon as the Foresters came into view of the Germans, they were shelled, mortared and machine gunned. And despite suffering very serious casualties, they managed to take the top of the hill.
The Foresters dug in to await the inevitable counterattack. When it came, the German infantry was supported by a number of tanks, including Tiger tanks.
As my father carried his platoons piert, he was ordered forward to engage the nearest one. After creeping forward as close as he dared to the thing, he took aim and fired, only to see his bomb strike a glancing blow on the turret and bounce off. But fortunately for him, at that point, the Tiger was hit by what my father was later told was a French 75, captured from the Germans by the Foresters, and the crew bailed out. And it later transpired that the turret had been jammed.
The Germans had withdrawn, but the position was still contested. Meanwhile, a Tiger tank sat just yards away from their foxholes.
My father and the Foresters were on the position for the next few days, during which time he saw a lot of excited technical experts crawling all over the thing, clearly amazed at the size and power of it.
Dale's father had died in 1982, but the similarity between the story of Tiger 131 and the story he'd been told as a teenager inspired him to find out more.
Dale's research identified that the action with the Sherwood Foresters took place near Guriat al-Atak on the 24th of April 1943. He discovered that the military knew the hill where the fighting took place as Point 174. Point 174 was about 10 miles away from Jebel Jaffa. This was the location of the 48th Royal Tank Regiment action, in which Peter Gudgeon participated 3 days earlier, on the 21st of April 1943. Dale also tracked down this footage in the Imperial War Museum's online film catalogue, a piece of film shot by the War Office Film Unit on the 26th of April 1943. The final sequence, shown here, is described as
a Tiger tank captured by the 2nd Battalion Sherwood Foresters.
We know that this tank is Tiger 131. The damage to the loader's hatch, the missing smoke discharger, and the step are all consistent with the other photographs and descriptions of the tank on its recovery.
I mean, one of the really interesting things that I discovered, I found 2 press cuttings from the 11th of May 1943. One was in the Daily Sketch and another one was in an Aberdeen paper.
Dale tracked down this original photograph in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. The caption reads,
"After a sharp engagement by the 2nd Battalion Sherwood Foresters in the advance towards Tunis, the Foresters gained an important ridge. After gaining this height, our men held a strong counterattack by the enemy, which was supported by tanks. Included in the attack was one of the German Tiger Mark VI tanks, which advanced to within 5 yards of our lines before being disabled, the crew surrendering to our troops. During the original attack on this position by our troops, a German anti-tank gun was captured, and it was with this gun that the Mark VI was knocked out."
This remarkable story, backed up by evidence showing the Foresters were credited with the capture at the time, is the stuff of movies. So how was it that this much more thrilling story was lost and replaced by a much more mundane account?
Apart from my father's memory that it happened, it didn't bear any great significance for the Foresters. The whole battle for Point 174 only occupies 3 lines of the war diary.
What of the evidence in the Tank Museum archive? The earliest documentary evidence here tells us that the tank was recovered on the 7th of May 1943 by Major Douglas Lidderdale of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Lidderdale was responsible for getting Tiger 131 from the battlefield in Tunisia via Horse Guards Parade to the School of Tank Technology in Surrey, where Gudgeon would later complete his technical evaluation of it. Back in 1943, Lidderdale clearly and carefully recorded in his papers the exact location from where the tank was recovered, Point 174. And yet Peter Gudgeon, a frequent visitor to the museum archive in his lifetime, still believed Tiger 131 was the tank that nearly killed him. Why? What may surprise many is that Lidderdale and Gudgeon knew each other, both in wartime at the School of Tank Technology and in peacetime when they exchanged letters on the subject of Tiger 131. On recovering Tiger 131 from the battlefield, Lidderdale had been told that 142 Royal Armoured Corps of 25 Tank Brigade had knocked it out. But Gudgeon was adamant that it was his unit, 48 Royal Tank Regiment of 21 Tank Brigade. Lidderdale's willingness to accept this is summarised in a letter to the museum curator in 1987, where he wrote that
he was there at the time, I only later.
Intriguingly, they didn't discuss the matter of location in their correspondence. We suspect they didn't realise they were talking about events at two different locations. As a result, they couldn't challenge each other and they didn't disagree.
But further examination of the movements of 48 Royal Tank Regiment in April 1943 revealed something intriguing. 3 days after the attack on Jebel Jaffa, B Squadron of 48 RTR was detached from 21 Tank Brigade and sent north. We understand that Peter Gudgeon may have been among them as an infantry liaison officer. The squadron was allocated to 142 Royal Armoured Corps under command of 25 Tank Brigade, who'd been assigned to support the Sherwood Foresters for their assault on Point 174. This was the unit Lidderdale had been told were responsible for knocking out Tiger 131.
As John Oscroft recalled, the tank support arrived late and the infantry took the hill without them. But 9 tanks arrived just in time to support them during the German counterattack. Taking up positions on a ridge behind the Foresters' positions, we know that B Squadron 48 RTR engaged the enemy tanks attacking Point 174.
Captain Rand saw an aerial mast moving along the ridge of 174. He put his gun onto it and informed the rest of 9 Troop. The tracks appeared and the tank was identified as a Mark 6. He told his troops to hold their fire, as there was one of our infantry carriers just below the Mark 6 and he thought an under might hit the carrier. This unfortunately happened, but the Mark 6 disappeared and came up again in a different position and was hit. The crew bailed out and were shot by our infantry.
By the time that 48 RTR withdrew from Point 174, they were able to record in their war diary that 5 enemy tanks had been destroyed. A Panzerkampfwagen Mark 6, a Tiger, was damaged. This must have been Tiger 131. For the first time over 75 years on, we now have an accurate picture of how Tiger 131 fell into British hands.
The Foresters, taking part in their first battle, assaulted and took Point 174 without support. They dug in, and under heavy shell and machine gun fire they beat off a number of infantry counterattacks. Then German armour appeared, and Tiger 131 made its way up the slope and into the Foresters' positions. Meanwhile, 9 Churchill tanks from 48 Royal Tank Regiment and 142 Royal Armoured Corps had just arrived on a ridge 500 yards to the rear as Tiger 131 came into view. The Foresters fired at Tiger 131 with everything they had, even small arms. John Oscroft was ordered forward with a Piat, but some quick-thinking Foresters turned around a 75mm anti-tank gun left behind by the Germans. The Churchill tanks opened fire, mistakenly hitting an infantry carrier. Now alerted to the presence of enemy armour, Tiger 131 reversed beneath the ridge and manoeuvred up into a new firing position. It fired at and destroyed one of the Churchill tanks. John Oscroft got as close as he dared to Tiger 131 and fired his Piat, but could only watch as the round struck a glancing blow. The Churchill tanks opened fire, and at the same time the Foresters fired their captured anti-tank gun at Tiger 131 at close range. The tank was stopped, and within moments the crew emerged from inside, although the sources disagree as to whether they surrendered or were shot down as they fled.
It's an enormously tantalizing prospect that Tiger 131, the first Tiger captured intact, was disabled by infantry using a captured anti-tank gun rather than by a Churchill tank. Measurement of the scars left by the disabling round suggests a 6-pounder as fired by a Churchill tank. But the angle of the hit and its accuracy equally suggest that it could have come from closer or from a lower angle. But we have to accept that the only trained anti-tank gunners present that day were sat in Churchill tanks.
I've learnt that old soldiers' recollections can't necessarily be taken at face value. And that's an approach I had with my father's story. I didn't assume that it was correct, because I know from reading about these things that being in action obviously affects people's perception of the events that take place around them.
Peter Gudgeon, who died in 2011, may have been incorrect in his belief that he faced and was knocked out of his tank by Tiger 131 at Jebel Jaffa. But we have to remember that he never claimed to have knocked out Tiger 131, just to have been there, and perhaps he was. The foresters held on to point 174, and they remained on the ridge for several days under heavy fire. In doing so, they sustained heavy casualties, but their dogged defense enabled the recovery of Tiger 131 by Major Lidderdale. And the importance of that recovery and the part it played in the education of Allied tank crews and designers in the next few months cannot be understated, nor can its importance to our ability to appreciate the vehicle and its history.
If my father were here today to see Tiger 131, he would be amazed to know that it is now the most famous tank in the world. And I think he would be proud to tell people the part that the foresters played in its capture. But at the same time, I think he would want people to understand its proper historical context. He would want people to know and to understand that although we can appreciate it as a fine piece of engineering, it was in fact a killing machine invented by the most heinous regime in history. And I think we should always remember that.